Hi there, I'm David Perlmutter. I'm a Master's of Urban Planning student at Columbia's Graduate School of Architecture, Planning, and Preservation. For my final project in Luc Wilson's Algorithms and Urbanisms course, I investigated the relationship between urban land use and travel behavior. Specifically, I looked at the relationship between gross residential densities and public transit performance metrics using data pulled from SimCity simulations. So here's an outline of my presentation. First, I'll present my research questions and then describe the experimental variables, show some shots of the simulation itself from the game, assemble the results, and derive some conclusions. I think this is an important topic given the push for cities to become more sustainable. There is a growing urban planning consensus that cities should pursue sustainable mobility by increasing overall residential density through development typologies like compact development or transit-oriented development patterns, and thereby you encourage residents to walk, bike, or take public transit rather than drive to their destinations. And in the real world, we know that as cities become more dense, vehicle miles traveled decline, and public ridership as well as public transit modal share both increase. And we also know that transit systems themselves become more economically efficient to operate in higher density cities, and that below the threshold of about 7 housing units per acre, give or take, high capacity transit service is generally not viable. I wanted to see if these well known real world relationships would hold up in SimCity. So my research questions are: what is the relationship between land use and travel behavior in SimCity? And second, what differences exist between the various transit modes of SimCity? Which operates most successfully or most according to what we know about real world travel and land use behavior, and why? And finally, do SimCity's parameters reflect what we know about real world travel behavior? Can real world travel patterns be replicated in the simulation? There might be patterns that throw things off that we might not be aware of. So a bit more background on this field of transportation research. We know the key thresholds for transit-supportive land use lie within half-mile radius corridors. That's considered the maximum distance people are willing to seek transit. Um, so 7 housing units per acre is generally considered the minimum for suburban bus transit. That's like the lowest frequency, every half hour or hour bus routes. And below that threshold, transit use will really be minimal, and you're really looking at kind of a demand response scenarios being the ideal transit below that density. 15 housing units per acre for high frequency bus, streetcar, or light rail. That seems to be the minimum there. And then for urban heavy rail systems like subways, you're looking at a minimum of 30 housing units per acre to be viable. And finally, again, we know that transit ridership, transit modal share, and subsidy per passenger trip are each correlated with density. Ridership and modal share both increase with density, and subsidy per passenger trip is expected to go down with density. And of course, density is just one of the metrics that impacts travel behavior. Public transit ridership is just one of those outcomes. Of course, there are many others apart from density that also have strong impacts on travel behavior, though a lot of theorists argue that density is one of the stronger independent variables we could look at. So that's why I was interested in it. So here are experiment variables. Residential density in housing units per acre, that's our X. We derive this number by dividing SimCity's population by the average household size of 2.5. So that gives you the number of housing units, roughly. And then you divide that number by the number of acres present on a single game tile, which is about 1,000, assuming that the game tile is 4 square kilometers. So our dependent variables, of course, are ridership, modal share, and operating expense per passenger. The first is straightforward. You just take a snapshot of how many passengers take transit on a given day. This SimCity simulation makes that very easy. And the second looks at the percentage of transit riders out of all trips that are made on an average day. So there, we divide the number of passengers by the sum of SimCity's workers, students, shoppers, and tourists. And the game unfortunately has a limited range of trip purposes into which we can assign our trips, so that's kind of what we got there. We are looking at 4 of the game's major modes. We're looking at bus, streetcar, rail, and maglev transportation. We're going to have to exclude ferry systems for now, just because we know less about those in the real world. So this simulation clip shows the general process I would use in the game of taking metrics from each station. In each simulation, I tried to ensure that transit lines were well connected and that citizens could access a relatively ubiquitous network to complete all of their possible trips. And in the next couple of shots, I'll show some highlights from the simulations. You can see that your sims, first of all, are not dumb. They're people with agency who have places to go, and they do demand transit service if it's not provided. Sometimes they'll even express a modal preference you might not expect, and for reasons we might not understand. So, for instance, in this case, you have sims calling for better bus service when there's a perfectly good streetcar available. However, that does in fact mirror reality. You look at cities like New York that are facing constant battles for limited funding between subway and bus agencies over who gets access to those capital and operations funds. Unfortunately, the bus riders who tend to be worse off economically, socioeconomically, bus riders tend to get the short end of the stick there and get less resources per passenger. So one of the biggest challenges of the simulation was actually achieving the higher residential densities that really enable high levels of transit ridership and modal share. So to get a density of, say, 50 units per acre, you need very high population cities. We're talking about at least 100,000 residents, and the more beyond that, the better. And that's tough to achieve in SimCity. You need to really think about what you're doing. So another interesting outcome was how transit types seem to fit into certain niches. Streetcars seem to be more popular with tourists. You can see all of the streetcars are gravitating towards the city's hotel district, while the buses were more popular across the board. And maglev and rail options were much less popular overall, and there was no clear pattern to their ridership. Of course, once you start reaching very high densities, this shot is about 130 units per acre, roughly the average density of neighborhoods in Hong Kong. You start to lose the relationship with reality. It's really very difficult to imagine a real city that dense, for instance, relying solely on bus service or streetcars and achieving a modal share upwards of 70%, like this scenario did. Now let's look at the results. Here we can see there are strong relationships between ridership and density for bus and streetcar modes. Because streetcars in SimCity have dedicated rights of way, there's no interference from other vehicular traffic, we can almost consider them analogous to light rail transit in the real world. So it seems that rail and maglev do not closely follow this relationship. They seem to be used for other purposes. It's hard to say what. It could be that rail is used for freight mostly, for industrial trips, while maglev is futuristic nonsense. Who's to say? We don't know much about maglev in the real world yet. However, the relationship between ridership and density is fairly strong, with an R-squared Pearson's correlation of about 0.56 overall. So that does reflect what we know about the real world. The relationship between density and modal share seems to be a bit more complicated. So streetcar and or light rail transit seems to be the only mode that really tracks closely with this relationship. If you look at the uppermost points in green, those are the very high density cities that have transit modal shares of upwards of 60 to 70% in streetcar systems. That's well above what we find in New York City and closer to what we see in cities like Tokyo, Seoul, Hong Kong, Paris. So very impressive results. It is interesting that streetcar is outperforming rail in that aspect. That is probably not realistic. And in terms of the average subsidy per passenger, we calculated this by taking the hourly expenditure on transportation given in SimCity's budget window and dividing it by the number of transit passengers. Overall, these results do not seem to support the relationship we find in the real world of transit systems becoming cheaper on a per passenger subsidy basis as density increases. However, the correlations for rail and streetcar modes do seem to show this relationship, which does fit what we know about real world transit systems. Rail and streetcar systems, more so than bus, have most of their cost in sunken capital expenses of track and infrastructure, while bus systems spend far more on operations in the form of labor and maintenance. So that's something that could be explored further, although I'm not sure how much more data is available in that aggregate budget figure that SimCity spits out. So conclusions, here's a final tally of our Pearson's correlations. We can see that streetcar by far dominates the correlation between density and our other dependent variables. And really this means that streetcar comes the closest to mimicking real-world travel behavior, closely followed by bus and then by rail. Maglev, on the other hand, seems to be, this futuristic white noise that they've included in the game, with no real relationship to the land use on the ground. Thank you so much for listening to my presentation. Have a great day.